So, well, I've been sitting on this for ages. Like, here's my idea. I'm going to do this right now, and you're going to do the same thing, I guess, on your computer. I mean, I could screen share, but that's probably cumbersome. I'm just going to call up Sydney Morning Herald website because I've been noting, there's an issue of the day. We tackle the issues of the day on this podcast, and the issue of the day for the last 6 months or something has been the Ukraine.
Yeah, your new favorite topic.
Yeah. Well, I suppose that's true.
Yeah.
Because I get like a little bit sniffy about, people who've only just heard that Ukraine existed, but it's not really like I've been focusing very much on it previously ever, despite being extremely opinionated about it, as you would expect me to be.
Yeah, I expect nothing less.
Indeed. But I mean, we both noticed, I remember talking about this, as soon as this war started, the Guardian website, which we both peruse from time to time, you more than me, I think. We did an episode relating to the Guardian before. The Guardian website became just like Ukraine propaganda central. I don't know what it's looking like now. I might just have a quick squiz. But for months, certainly the UK edition of the Guardian kept this up slightly longer than the Australian edition. But like the first thing you had, like if you load the Guardian UK edition page, you had like a huge, they've now dropped it down, but you would get like a huge number of Ukraine stories, and that would be what it would lead with. And that lasted for like 2 months, and like absolutely histrionic, like super, super biased, let's say, towards the Ukrainian side. Local news media in this country, are Fairfax newspapers, which historically have been the more left-wing Australian newspapers, but have been kind of corporatized and kind of de-wokeized in recent years. So they were acquired by the television channel, Channel 9. I believe that's currently who owns Fairfax still. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. So it's a bit less. And actually the pattern for months has been that they would have a single article every day on Ukraine. And I thought, because they're not quite as crazy, they're more of a kind of like middle of the road crazy that you expect to see when it comes to Ukraine and the Western media. So, I mean, sorry, I haven't got your permission buy-in for this at all, but like my thought is we would go to the Sydney Morning Herald website, we would scroll down, find their single Ukraine article, and then we would talk about it.
Let's do it.
Okay, but it may be that there's not one, because actually I've been thinking about this for months, but in recent, there's zero. So I've just done the find function on the Sydney Morning Herald front page, like zero, jack shit about Ukraine. So because the Ukraine has now been dropping off the agenda. So, however,
particularly in Australia, I think, because I looked at the Guardian's English front page this morning for reasons I can't recall, and it's still much more prominent
than it is here.
Yeah,
but that also, I think, is partly about the different kind of politico-editorial stance of the Guardian in the UK. The Guardian in the UK is and has been for many years now, like for however long this fast has been going, 25 years, has been the Blairite newspaper.
Yeah.
So it's been like very, R2P, like neo-imperialist when it comes to, war. And whereas Australia, the Guardian in Australia has had much, its brand is being lefty, in a much more dedicated way. Like it's
I think that's right. It has its own significant problems, but it's a totally different strain of progressivism or left-wingism, I guess you would say.
Yeah, I think that's right. And therefore, they're not as obsessed with Ukraine as the Blairites are. And I mean, it's also the geographical situation in Australia. But look, what I've done here, I've gone into the world section.
World.
So we're going to see in their world news, they do, because if you click on world, the world tab at the top.
Here we go.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So here it is. Here's the nonsense article. But you've really got to dig deep to find it. So I've done the find function. There's two mentions of Ukraine on the world page, and it's the same article twice. The article I'm talking about is dangerous beach season, in quotes, kicks off on Ukrainian coast laced with explosive mines. I'm immediately consternated about this, right? There's a great danger this will degenerate even more than usually into just me ranting.
It does seem like an ever-present danger, but
it's particularly dangerous here because I've set up this entire theme.
I mean, do we need some kind of backstory at least to some extent for the listeners? in regards to your relationship to this conflict? Because I feel like
My relationship to this conflict.
your personal relationship with Ukraine. Because I feel like this in particular, perhaps even more than your spicy takes on Trump, may surprise some people. So maybe is it necessary to have at least some degree of backstory for this reaction or not?
I could give I don't have any relationship with the Ukraine at all. Other than, I have, as you say, opinions about Ukraine, which I would present as purely factual, neutral observations.
I mean, I'm even willing to go that far, but
I just had my more sober thoughts about Ukraine published today. The new issue of Telos, summer 2022, issue 199 of Telos just came out today and has my piece "Bleeding Ukraine" in it, where I lay out some of my thoughts. I just, Ukraine is very simple. Well, maybe that's going a bit too far, but it's a fairly simple situation, which has been like wholly dissimulated about by the Western media, largely I think because they don't understand even the basic facts about Ukraine. I mean, the basic facts about Ukraine as presented in the Western media is, Ukraine is a country, Russia is a country, Russia has invaded Ukraine. That is bad. Like, it is bad to invade countries, like one country invades another. And Russia is a big country and Ukraine is a little country. I mean, I remember seeing this guy, ex-British squaddy who'd gone off to die in Ukraine to fight the Russians, who'd said he'd gone because he didn't like bullies. That was his entire explanation for going to like kill and die in Ukraine.
Wars have been fought over less.
Well, I don't know if that's true, but like the truth of this, which, as laid out in great detail by Putin, did the invasion, is that the longer history of this is Ukraine is the Ukraine. Ukraine is the Russian word for a borderland. The Ukraine was a region of Russia which broke off from Russia and declared independence. And actually, like for the first time 100 years ago. But under German sponsorship, this is going to be kind of a long history now, right?
Yeah,
because I'm saying it's simple. But yeah, like, so basically what happened, there was some people that you get people like this. You have people like this in the north of England. You have people like this in Western Australia, people who are regionalists and want to say their part of the country should be independent. And this happened in this part, the Ukraine, this southwestern part of Russia. And they achieved independence because, the Bolsheviks, when they took power in 1917, made peace with the Germans and gave enormous tracts of Western Russia to Germany. And then they got a puppet government in the Ukraine. And then, had this kind of anarchy and chaos of the Russian Revolution, Russian Civil War, which went on for like 4 years, in which the Ukraine kind of had like a semi-autonomous existence, and then ultimately got bailed up into the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union, had a kind of divide and conquer approach to its regions, so that it was federalist and it was following good kind of proto-Marxist-Leninist principles based in Austrian Marxism about the self-determination of nations. So they gave the Ukrainians their own state within the Soviet Union, which didn't really matter because it was a highly centralized country. And yeah, they created this thing, the Ukrainian SSR, Soviet Socialist Republic, which then existed for 70 years. And then the Soviet Union fell apart, despite the fact that everyone in every part of the Soviet Union, except for the Baltic republics, voted for it not to fall apart. And then when it fell apart, the Ukraine came into existence as a country. I should remember, actually, there's another story here which is relatively important to understand Ukraine history, which is, of course, the Germans came and conquered Ukraine again in 1941. And the Ukraine again had a kind of semi-autonomous existence again under German tutelage for a second time. Because these two events are very important, particularly the second one, but also this meant that Ukrainians, when Ukraine became independent in 1991 from the Soviet Union, they could look back to their glorious past as a Nazi puppet and a German imperial puppet early in the 20th century and say, well, that's who we are. I don't know what else there is to say. Yeah, the Ukraine kind of like stumbled along as an independent country for 23 years. Until the CIA sponsored a takeover of the country.
There it
by some clients in 2014 in the so-called Maidan Revolution, which is now, I can't even think what it's called. The Ukrainians now call it like the Revolution of Peace and Friendship or something. I can't remember there's some ludicrous name Ukrainians call it. I'm really going to get myself in trouble here, aren't I? But anyway, yeah. So the basically NATO. In fact, it's really the organization that should be mentioned here. NATO did a coup to take over Ukraine, which previously had been in the Russian sphere of influence. And I mean, coup's like a little bit confusing, but like violent street protest that killed the police and took over the country.
I think it's important to just take a moment at that point though, because a lot of this narrative is going to be unfamiliar to a lot of people. Right? Like, this is going to come as news, which is not to say it's wrong, but I guess there's two things here. One is that it does seem as if I'm as suspicious, and maybe not as suspicious, but I'm extremely skeptical of the kind of current media. Western media, I should say, Western media approach to the conflict, in particular, the kind of insane warmongering sort of being presented as some vision for peace. Just in terms of, especially in particular, those people clamoring for, more arms and all this kind of stuff. That's fine. I mean, but I guess the next question, I think we can all, it does appear as if, and again, you know more about this than me, but it does appear as if the quote unquote coup in 2014 did seem to have some fairly sketchy people involved, including probably the CIA in some way. I guess the question, before we get to the article, which we should do, but I think even if we accept that there is some pretty dodgy things going on, there are some pretty dodgy things going on in the Ukraine. Does that I shouldn't say use the word justify, but does that necessarily justify, let's use the word, the invasion? I mean, I don't want to sound like a kind of a weak lettuce here, but there's just a terrible loss of life going on in both sides, and I it seems, sorry to be a basic bitch, but that seems bad.
Yeah, sure. No, but I look, I don't think you need to apologize about that. Look, it's what is happening in the Ukraine currently. This war is absolutely horrifying. Like, it is. Like,
it's just a massacre. Like, it's just unbelievable thing.
It is. Yeah. I mean, I have to think we're looking at this point, late June, probably 60,000 dead between civilians and soldiers, mostly military casualties, but maybe higher than that. It's
like it's a kind of old school European war. Like, it's a meat grinder.
Kind of, yeah, it is a meat grinder. I mean, it's actually, it has some certain novel aspects, but yeah, it's very interesting the way that new technologies in this war have leveled out things. So, I mean, in particular, that the wars we've been used to seeing over the last 30 years have been, the wars the West has fought using overwhelming air power against, places like Serbia and Iraq, which couldn't really fight back against it. And in this war, because the West has been supplying the Ukrainians with arms so profligately, it basically seems that the Soviets, although they have overwhelming air superiority, can't really use it that much because the number of manpads the Ukrainians have. So that kind of takes that out of the equation. Yeah, but that takes out of the equation, and then has meant that it's mainly become an artillery war for most of it. I mean, the kind of initial kind of weeks were a bit crazier than this, but it's basically become an artillery war. It's also partly because Russia's, it's weird parapraxis. Russia's military doctrine, like since the Second World War, has been artillery first. Like that's what Russia does, and that's what they're doing in Ukraine. It's also incidentally because Ukraine is, Russia. They're Russians with the same military history, so they have exactly the same military doctrine. It's a kind of artillery duel, but like hopelessly, in the Russians' favor. Yeah, I mean, look. So going back to what you were saying, I got to 2014, but there's the war is 2022. I mean, so there's 8 years there, and what happened in those 8 years is that. So I mean, look, Ukraine historically, and you can look at the maps. It's roughly divided. This since the independence, or the country that came into existence of Ukraine, which was based on this Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, borders of which were determined by, as I say in my Telos piece, the internal calculations of the Soviet state, not the decision to produce a cohesive independent state. But it's basically divided in twain between a kind of Ukrainian side and a Russian side. So, there's a lot of blurring in the middle, but, you look at the map of the election results of any Ukrainian election, including in recent years, you basically see the east and the south of the country vote for one candidate, the west and the north vote for another candidate. If you look at the linguistic map, the west, the far west of the country, speaks a language called Ukrainian, which is really a dialect of Russian by any reasonable standard, but a dialect that's quite aberrant, whereas half the country speaks standard Russian. Yeah, that's the Ukraine. And when the so-called Maidan happened in 2014, and Maidan's the word for a public square, because of course that's where the contestation of power occurred, particularly in Kiev, but in other parts of the country as well. The south and the east decided to leave the country, and this is because the incoming, pro-NATO regime, which, and I should be clear about this. When I talk about the CIA, obviously it sounds quite conspiratorial. I'm not saying that literally, 5 guys in sunglasses from Langley, Virginia turned up and toppled the government. It's the fruit of a very long process of soft power, civil society sponsorship, and so on. And look, a lot of it was, I think really the most crucial impetus for the Maidan revolution to happen was a kind of neoliberal incentive scheme that people in Ukraine desperately wanted to be able to do what people in neighboring Poland could do, which is go and work in London or Paris, go and work in Western Europe by becoming members of the EU. They wanted to be Europeans because they wanted the economic opportunities. And Ukraine is a prodigiously poor country, like much poorer than Russia on a per capita income basis. And because, Ukraine is a country which had the kind of destiny that Russia had immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was immediately taken over by corrupt oligarchs who looted it. And this happened in all the post-Soviet states. But in Russia, over the 10 years after the end of the Soviet Union, you had this new order under Vladimir Putin that coalesced, where you had the state security services putting in a strongman who then curbed the excesses of oligarchic corruption in Russia. That just never happened in Ukraine. So Ukraine's just remained insanely corrupt. Yeah. So Ukraine, and consequently completely poor, it just hasn't had a chance. Even that Russia's become much wealthier, relatively in the last 20 years than it was in the kind of post-Soviet period, which was just a complete catastrophe. And Ukraine hasn't. Anyway, so people were desperate, economically desperate, and that produced a lot of support, generated a lot of support for this. But in the south of the west of the country, including, large cities like Kharkov and Odessa, people, rose up to try to break away, and, neo-Nazi death squads from Western, and not always Western Ukraine. Some of them were native to Eastern Ukraine, particularly the Azov battalion, which was raised originally in Kharkov, which is historically the biggest Russian-speaking city, very pro-Russian historically in Ukraine. These gangs of neo-Nazi football hooligans basically moved into southern and eastern Ukraine and killed, the leading kind of pro-Russian activists. The reason for this, that these people decided to break away from Ukraine, was that the incoming regime after the Maidan was going to suppress the Russian language, the native language of half the population of Ukraine, which they've done subsequently. They've tried to Ukrainize the whole country, tried to make everyone speak Ukrainian, which is a foreign language. To the extent it's a separate language at all, which I would dispute. But they've tried to convert the whole country to Ukrainian speaking. So these guys just brutally crushed these rebellions, except in the furthest furthest eastern parts of the country, in the Donbass, and particularly in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, where people were. Basically, the pro-Russian sentiment was so extreme. The vicinity to the Russian border and having assistance from Russians was enough that they managed to create little independent states, which the Ukrainian armed forces have been unable to reconquer over 8 years.
I think this is good in that it speaks to a running theme of this podcast, which is, and I think, and you've touched on a few of these things, but one that does not come up really at all in the Western media coverage of this is the extent to which many of these Ukrainian soldiers, at least in the on the Russian borders, are explicitly neo-Nazi. And I think this is something that is just like totally ignored. And like, regardless of what we think about the broader picture of these current events, I think we can conclude that certainly, and maybe this is a banal point, but certainly events on the ground are far more ambiguous than they're presented in the media, which I think it's worth just hovering on that point. I mean, as with all wars, and I think maybe you said this to me earlier on, is that like the disparity between what is being reported, especially in the early days of the Ukraine war, the disparity between what is being reported and what was actually happening on the ground made me doubt every single account of war I had ever read. Because when these kinds of things happen, especially this kind of war, an artillery war where men are just going into this kind of meat grinder of combat, no one has any idea what is going on ultimately. Those on the ground would, but those reporting on it just can't really get the required context. And as with all these big geopolitical things, no one really knows what it means, especially in the short term.
Yeah, I mean, this is true to an extent. It's very important with this current conflict to try to be a little tempered in what one says because of the fog of war, effect. Like, we don't know what's going on.
That's the expression I was
looking. And yeah, and it's very hard because you have, well, actually, this war, it's very strange. I don't know how this really compares to previous wars. I mean, what you have is there's two kind of sides of the story, as there would be any war with two sides, but the information is very asymmetric. I mean, it's asymmetric in the opposite way to the military situation. So the Ukrainian side just deluging with information have been since day one, large portions of which are just bullshit. But that's the war they're fighting. They're fighting a propaganda war, and it's very, very important for the Ukrainians because, of course, their great ace in the hole is support from the West. So it's really important for them to kind of win a propaganda war directed at Western audiences. Russia, obviously, like any country, needs to kind of package things appropriately for its home audience. But the Russians are much less sophisticated. And generally, they're very secretive. I mean, this comes partly by the fact that the country's run by a spy. So where the Ukrainians are constantly publishing kind of ludicrously inflated figures about how many tanks they've destroyed and stuff, the Russians generally are just silent about this stuff. I mean, another really obvious disparity is the fact that Ukrainian troops all just have their mobile phones with them and are constantly uploading pictures of the war crimes they're committing and God knows what. Whereas Russian troops are not allowed to have phones. So, they've had some exceptions. But, in the initial part of the war, like, if you're on the internet, you'd have huge amounts, potentially volume of raw footage of fighting and stuff from the Ukrainian side, like literally nothing coming from the Russian side. That kind of started to open up because the Russians started seeing the effectiveness, and there was the Chechens had like an exemption and had mobile phones and were good at posting some really funny stuff. But I mean, the bottom line in the Western media is that, and okay, like let's go to the article.
Yeah,
I don't know if it's gonna. I mean, the thing that the Western media typically does is it just reports whatever the Ukrainian government has said, which is often like unhinged and crazy, as being factually accurate. But they do say so. I mean,
this is an amazing headline, though. Just quite.
So the dangerous. I mean, look, I'll say it again. Always cautious with headlines. I struggle to remember this, but the byline says London, so I'm assuming this is it's from the Washington Post. Scroll to the bottom, like a lot of international coverage in Cinema Herald. It's actually culled from a foreign newspaper.
Yeah.
The headline, headlines, because editors can change headlines. This may not even been the headline this article went to press with it in the Washington Post. And so, you can't blame the journalists, but that dangerous beach season, quote marks. Yeah, I mean, that seems like an understatement. Maybe that's why it's got the scare quotes. Kicks off on Ukrainian coast, laced with explosive mines. I guess I have to say explosive mines. Otherwise, do you think it was like coal mines or something, which I guess could be true?
I mean, what I want to know is, I just read that Ukraine won't be able to host Eurovision next year because of the war. If that's the case, if they can have beach season, surely they can have Eurovision. This doesn't seem right to me. That's my contribution.
I'm now focusing on this photograph, and I don't know what's going on here. Why is this woman looking at this guy in this particular way? Like, he's looking very pleased with himself. She looks like slightly concerned. Very odd image. Apparently, this is in Odessa, in the Ukraine. I don't know. I've got a lot of thoughts. Beachgoers in Ukraine should watch out for hazardous mines that lie underwater. Ukraine's National Guard warns after the death of a man who was diving in the Odessa region before a device exploded and killed him. So they're talking about sea mines. Of course, they could be talking about land mines. There was, I've seen some videos of Russians clearing land mines that were laid on beaches in areas that the Russians have now taken. I've got to start. I anticipated this with the title, right? They say laced with explosive mines. This is, it's almost like a passive voice thing. Like, who has laced them? Who has laced the coast with explosive mines? And they haven't said it yet. And I've got to think they're not going to say who's laid these mines. I'm going to scroll through. Mines are a growing problem. Someone's quoted here saying the Russians ruined our peaceful environment. I mean, that again seems like a ludicrous understatement to describe a country invading you, but anyway. Mines have become a challenge. It's here we go. Halfway down, it's unclear which side's mine led to the death of a man in Odessa region. Ukraine has also planted landmines, but a suspected, and they say a suspected Russian mine washed up on the Ukrainian beach in Odessa region following storm. I mean, so this is. I've just had the phrase hit me in my head, which is what I always, the phrase that always spontaneously comes to my mind when I read stuff in the Western media about the Ukraine, which is this is hallucinatory nonsense. Like,
so let's speak in concrete terms. What is your concern here, Kelly?
The Russians aren't mining shit. Like, why the fuck? It just absolutely defies belief. But this is an absolutely standard tactic, which is the Ukrainians, much as they're now shelling Donetsk and saying that the Russians are shelling it, despite it clearly being under Russian control. Like, again, like, why? So why would the Russians be laying mines when they're invading a country? That's something you do. It's a defensive measure. So so they're saying, oh, okay, a Russian mine has washed up on a beach. So what, the Russians are laying mines in their waters? I mean, the Ukrainians don't have a navy. A lot of this stuff makes sense if you believe some of the stuff in the media that seems to suggest that the Ukrainians might be launching credible offensive operations against the Russians. But it's just not true. I mean, the Russians are attacking Ukraine. Whatever you think about the morality of that, the Ukrainians have been laying mines all over the place, particularly on the coast, because they're worried since the Russians have a reasonable sized navy in the Black Sea and the Ukrainians have jack shit, that the Russians will do. And they've been really wise since the beginning, because Odessa is, like, historically very pro-Russian. Despite how far west it lies, indeed, very prominently in the 2014 Maidan, it was the scene of a particular outrage where a building full of pro-Russian activists was burnt. The pro-Russian activists were burned alive. Odessa is it's also an obvious target. It's a major military center. It's often been suggested that the Russians want to take the whole coast. I mean, there's a whole, this whole thing, the dangerous beach season kicks off on Ukrainian coast. I mean, the even question of the existence of a Ukrainian coast at this point, most of the, pre-2014 coastline of the Ukraine is now not only under Russian military control, but has been incorporated into Russia, or is in the process of being incorporated to become part of Russia one way or the other, of the Donetsk People's Republic. So most of the Ukrainian coast is not Ukrainian coast anymore, but they do have like a bit still west of Kherson, so particularly around Odessa. It's heavily mined. So, I mean, Odessa, there's like a huge, I'm just ranting, sorry. Odessa's like, it's a big deal. So, I'm sure you may have heard the fact that, Ukraine is, after Russia, like the biggest wheat supplier in the world. It's basically a huge wheat field. That's why the Germans annexed it in 1918, 1917, whichever year it was. Must have been 18 by the time they actually got their hands on it. German troops in 1918 actually went in and no, must have been 17. They harvested the wheat harvest because they were under tremendous pressure food wise. They just kind of stole it. The whatever the German military at that point was called. Really rambling. Apologize. So Odessa is the port where all the wheat comes out of, right? Okay, one reason, so they can't get wheat out of Ukraine currently because Ukraine has mined the port, because Ukraine was reasonably worried that the Russians were doing an amphibious operation to take Odessa. But yeah, the Ukrainians have basically completely blocked that off. So, okay, what is happening here is Ukrainians are getting blown up by Ukrainian ordnance. I mean, okay, and that's sad. It's completely normal that they, of course, the Ukrainian officials should warn people not to go swimming around Odessa because they'll get blown up by mines. That's like perfectly normal. But like, what is the story here? The story here is that the dastardly Putin is blowing up Ukrainians. I mean, not really true. I mean, okay, you can claim that he's created as someone does, like, he's ruined their peaceful environment by creating a hostile situation where previously they could go swimming and now they can't. The imputation here, and at one point, kind of, I mean, the way it's couched is very careful. It says it's unclear which side led to death the man in the Odessa region. What does that mean? Well, it means like this journalist has not seen the serial numbers on that mine. There's no reasonable doubt, like that what side's mine. I'm not saying that the Ukrainians shouldn't have mined Odessa because they should be worried about people swimming, right? But the way the whole couching of it is to try and produce the impression that the Russians aren't only like creating a hostile environment, as this spokesperson puts it, but that they're directly killing. They directly killed this guy, which they can't claim. And there's this claim. They have this story. A suspected Russian mine has washed up the Ukrainian region, which I think is beyond ludicrous, unless it's like from the Second World War or something. Okay, but what's the source? Oh, the Ukrainian military said that. Okay, well, that's not a reliable source, right? And it's on Facebook as well. It's from the Facebook page of Operational Command South, a branch of the Ukrainian military. I shared a video of the drive's being destroyed. I mean, I don't know.
I think this is clearly an example of, as you say, like when you actually lay out the sort of the logic of how sea mines actually work, it sounds like highly unlikely that it would be laid by a Russian, because as you say, mines are defensive. And indeed, in the last paragraph of this article, it actually quotes Russian intelligence that says, in March, the Bad Weather Corps had caused more than 400 naval mines, it said, were laid by Ukraine to become disconnected from the cables that were anchoring them. Russia said the devices were now drifting freely across the western parts of the Black Sea, a key trade route. Ukraine dismissed Moscow's claims, accusing Russia of using alleged drifting weapons as an excuse to close off parts of the sea. And I think this just comes back to that broader point we're making, that this is, I mean, I completely accept what you were saying, Mark, but I also at the same time don't actually know either way, insofar as people do all kinds of ludicrous shit in war on both sides. And I think to me, it clearly sounds as if defensive mines have drifted free and now they're blowing up their own citizens.
Yeah. It's not even like, look, that could happen. It's not even like that implies like terrible Ukrainian negligence or something. I mean, maybe it does, but like, I don't know. I don't know how securely anchored naval mines generally are. But yeah, like the Russian claim here is, I think, perfectly credible. I mean, Ukraine maybe. I mean, okay, maybe that's like I don't really understand. I mean, I guess what's the claim? The Russians are doing a kind of scare campaign, not directed at Ukraine, because Ukraine can't do anything anyway. So it's like Ukrainian shipping isn't coming out of Odessa because of so there's Turkish ships, for example, caught in Odessa currently because they were moored there when the war started, and then the Ukrainians have mined behind them, so they're stuck in the port. Okay. Well, I mean, I guess the claim would be, if we're talking about, I haven't looked at this particular story before, but maybe they're claiming that Romania and Bulgaria, like the countries with shores in the Western Black Sea, can't use the shipping, which maybe the Russians don't, I mean, they're NATO members or whatever. So Russia's saying this to scare them, and maybe, I mean,
I think this is more interesting within the context of like the Western media coverage of the conflict. Like, you remember the early days when there was that kind of, again, regardless of where you sit on the war itself, the reports coming from the Western media in regards to that, the defeats the Russians were experiencing. And you remember there was all this stuff about how they were running out of fuel and they were bogged down and all this kind of stuff. All of these initial reports in the first month or so of the war were clearly ludicrous, because since that time, none of the things have really come to that were predicted have come to pass. Namely, that Putin had underestimated the Ukrainian defense, blah 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 blah. And as the war continues, and as it becomes clear that Russia is actually like tightening the screws, that the media coverage of it becomes much more ambivalent, and you can see it in the tone here, insofar as the ambiguities of an actual concrete war become impossible to hide entirely behind just kind of ludicrous propaganda. And here you've got a kind of, well, I guess it's just a kind of cope mechanism, really. You have the ambiguity of this conflict, like deliberately kind of presented in the media in a way that will still fit the kind of the narrative at the moment, but it becomes increasingly difficult for these facts to fit that narrative. And I think that's really telling, and especially within the context of sort of other wars that have been fought within the last sort of 20 odd years.
There's, I mean, obviously grains of truth, in the standard narrative. I mean, in particular, like, I think there were like setbacks in the initial Russian advance. Like, there were things did get, individual things got bogged down, but there was an incredible focus in, and I'm not sure so much about the media, because I've really switched off the media. I mean, it's but in terms of like pro-Ukrainian like social media, there's a huge focus on like highly, like little individual instances that give you no strategic picture at all. So like, there's like this famous footage of a Russian tank being like stolen by gypsies in a tractor during the invasion. I think that's what turned out to be happening. I mean, certainly being towed by a Ukrainian tractor. Well, as I say, certainly, but it's very unclear. I mean, there's a systematic lack of clarity actually here, because unless you're extremely tutored in these things, I mean, I can't tell the difference between Ukrainian and Russian military equipment. It's very, very hard to do, because they use a lot of the same equipment. Like a lot of it's like Soviet era. It's very, very hard to do. So I've got no idea whether that tank was actually Russian anyway. I mean, it could all be completely false, but it doesn't matter. Like, the fact in a war, like someone loses a tank, like, or, some people, there's like people are going to get killed. Like, you're going to have, the fact that the Ukrainians have like conducted certain successful limited operations against Russian troops and killed Russian troops and blown up Russian tanks has like virtually zero strategic meaning. I mean, I got in an argument with Nick Land on Twitter about this right at the get-go, because he was very much, I've stopped. Yeah, I haven't been, because I got rid of that Twitter account. I haven't been following Nick lately, but because Nick was very on the like, oh, this is a catastrophe, like straight away, which is a standard media thing. It's like, oh, the Russians have totally fucked up, like, because they, I mean, it started off very ludicrous. It's like, oh, it's been a week and the Russians haven't conquered the whole country yet. What a bunch of losers. You're just like, well, that doesn't really make even the slightest amount of sense. Like, how long it's just kind of hard to do, like, takes a while. But then, of course, there was this very dramatic, very sudden Russian withdrawal from Kiev. I mean, Russia surrounded Kiev on like 3 sides, and then they just completely withdrew. And they, similarly in Kharkov, they didn't withdraw quite as much, but to a large extent they withdrew from around Kharkov. And this really left people guessing. I mean, one of but again, you have this problem. The Russians, what did the Russians say? Not much. Like, Russians were like, because the Russians never said what they were doing. Like, they never said, people are like, people got hysterical. Were like, oh, Putin's going to capture Kiev. And then when he didn't, they're like, oh, Putin fucked up. He was going to capture Kiev. Putin never said anything about capturing Kiev, right? Like, he never suggested it for a minute. All the Russians said is, oh yeah, phase 1's complete. We're doing phase 2 now, which is they're going to liberate the Donbass region, which obviously is like their key war aim from the beginning. But like, I don't know what happened there. There's at least there's 3 possible accounts here, right? There's the Ukrainian account, which is that the Russians were defeated in a triumphant battle for Kiev, were militarily defeated in the field and forced to withdraw, which is clearly just not what happened at all. It's very clear it's not what happened, because it's very clear that the Russians withdrew, and then like 3 days later, the Ukrainians moved into the positions the Russians had vacated. Like, the Russians withdrew in good order. It wasn't a forced retreat. They just decided to leave. The other stories, like, I actually lean towards the version that says the Russians thought that Kiev and Kharkov would just surrender. And when they didn't, they just said, well, we're not going to storm these giant cities. It would be totally crazy. So they just said, well, there's no point in holding positions around them. We'll just redeploy our troops elsewhere, which is like a very sensible strategic thing to do, in my view. But there's another line of thought run by some quite sensible and knowledgeable people that says actually the entire attack was, designed to do what it did, which is it destroyed a whole bunch of stuff and, forced the Ukrainians to move troops around, and it was just part of a war that was always going to be focused on the Donbass. As I say, I don't really believe that, but a lot of people who are fairly sensible say it. At least kind of like, I mean, it's a little bit kind of, Putin's playing 3D chess, but it's at least not totally implausible.
I think this is because obviously you're following totally, because I still only follow, as is becoming abundantly clear, I only follow this conflict in the mainstream media. And so you're exposed to things and information and details that I just do not have access to. And nor do I want access to, because that's just too much of a rabbit hole for me. Like it's just for me, it's out of sight, out of mind.
Obviously, not following these things is always the advised position. Like the extent to which I follow this stuff is the great excuse for this obsession for me has been like, I actually kind of professionally wrote something about it, you know. So, but then like I became that led to me becoming way more preoccupied, because I'm like, well, I've got a piece coming out in print, so I now need to know everything because I've got to cover all the bases.
Yeah.
So, but there's not much. I mean, actually, the war became very boring very quickly. I mean, the first week was very, very exciting. All this kind of crazy stuff happening, and that's one reason the West just turned off. Like as an entertainment product, this war has stopped delivering completely. There's nothing entertaining about this war anymore. It's just people dying, and very, very. And it's like, as you said, it's like it's an old school. I mean, it's not quite First World War, but like a little bit trench-based warfare, very slow positional movements. Yeah. And I'm keenly exposed to these, the maps where like a tiny chunk goes, and people understand, people who know what they're talking about, I think, understand this is very important and strategically significant, but it's very hard to actually get excited about.
Maybe I've read too many war memoirs in my time, but I find myself just desperately sad about the whole situation. Just desperately sad. I think the triumphalism that comes from the Western media is kind of despicable. And you saw it in, I mean, speaking of the British Guardian, you saw it with Iraq, you see it again now. But I also at the same time think, despite all of the probably quite real, or at least half true concerns about the CIA's involvement with the Ukraine and just America's involvement with Ukraine in general, and indeed the worrying kind of economic effects of the EU and all those kinds of things, I just find it terribly hard to have an opinion on it other than just deep sadness about the loss of life and all the poor fuckers who are either dead, maimed, or in the mud suffering. Again, maybe that's a banal thing to say.
No, it's the correct response.
I find it very hard to think beyond that point.
It's heartbreaking. It's tragic, genuinely tragic. In a real sense, it's it's horrendous. So, and the only thing I can think is, well, something else should have happened. But it's very hard to. Now we get very philosophical, but I don't believe that, other worlds may be possible in the future, but the world we have is the world we have. Look, I think to make another political point though here, which is much drier than the point you're making actually, but the reason this war is going on the way it's going on is that it's a war directed from Washington. Zelensky is not, this ludicrous kind of clown hero of the Western media is not in charge. He doesn't have the ability to. My God. Here's something that I haven't seen reported on in the mainstream media. They had these peace negotiations, that they've been going on with the Russians really early on. They started right away. There was peace negotiations from day one. Incidentally, one of the, I haven't really actually, although I gave the story up to 2022, I haven't spoken about the casus belli here, right? Like why did this war happen? Essentially for, a bunch of reasons. One, this possibility of Ukraine joining NATO, which seemed to be very real. Like it turns out, we now know that it wasn't going to happen. But the official NATO position was something like, to the Ukrainians, allowing the Ukrainians to believe, allowing the world to believe that Ukraine might join NATO, even though there was no intention of it happening. Okay, from a Russian perspective, strategically speaking, they need to attack. If they're ever going to do anything about anything in Ukraine, they need to do it before this happens, because once they join NATO, then that means that America and Britain and France have a responsibility to defend Ukraine using nuclear weapons, right? So that's one thing that triggered this war happening. Another thing is Zelensky, in the course of the year leading up to this war, said that he was going to forcibly retake the Donbass republics. He was going to forcibly reconquer them, and Crimea, which Russia had annexed. So he was going to invade what Russia saw as its sovereign territory. Obviously, we could certainly say that their annexation was illegal or something, but he was being incredibly belligerent towards the Russians, believing NATO was going to back him, which in a sense it has. And lastly, I think the evidence is there. This attack on the Donbass was happening. The artillery bombardments had begun prior to the Russian invasion. The Russian invasion actually was launched, and one of the reasons they had these fuck-ups in the invasion is it wasn't fully prepared. They were forced to launch it because the Ukrainians have massed troops and were going to retake Donetsk. And this is one reason why the Russians just walked over the northern border. There was zero defense. There were no Ukrainian soldiers. I mean, Ukraine has the second largest military in Europe after Russia. The Ukraine had no military units on its northern border at all. They were all in the Donbass. I mean, the Ukraine did not believe at all that Russia was going to invade. It was caught by surprise, despite the fact America had been saying for months it was going to.
I think this is right, though. I mean, like in the sense that I think we can agree that America's involvement is much more substantial than is recognized. In particular, the kind of the slow burn of the last sort of 10 years or so, where there was just a refusal to acknowledge the deep geopolitical dangers of letting it appear as if Ukraine could join, the EU and NATO without there being any kind of problem. And the very logic of the nation state demands, it may be deeply fucked up, but the logic of the nation state demands that Russia does what it did, right? If confronted with that situation. And so regardless of the moral status of that move. And I think that is really the root. And people were saying it, people were warning that this rhetoric was going to lead to this in the end. And again, people always forget that really this conflict started in 2014. And it's that slow burn which really needs, and no one gave a fuck about that. I mean, even.
But it's worse because this war is the direct outcome of US foreign policy.
Yeah.
The US deliberately provoked this war and they wanted it to happen, and it's good for them.
Yeah.
Nothing that has happened so far has been, actually the only thing that's happened that's bad has been the sanctions. So the sanctions, the economic side is actually a catastrophic American fuck up. I think they've basically completely screwed the pooch economically. Their sanctions on Russia hurt the West far more than they have Russia. They've really fucked up.
Why is that? Because why is that?
Well, essentially because why is it fucked them up? Well, I mean, the obvious reason is Russia is essentially a primary producer that produces things that other countries desperately need, namely oil, gas, urea, other minerals, and wheat. So the world desperately needs Russian primary produce. Russia doesn't need shit from the West because the West no longer produces anything at all anyway, except for luxury goods.
Yeah.
So all the sanctions on Russia are like, oh, you can't have an iPhone anymore. You can't have an Audi anymore, right? But you can still buy a perfectly good Chinese-made phone or car, right? And so basically, and also it's also the case that since 2014, and specifically the Russian annexation of Crimea, which actually I've been remiss in not mentioning this enough because this was, very serious kind of thing that happened in 2014 that led to, so the US has had sanctions on Russia since 2014 because of the Crimea thing. So actually all the low hanging fruit in terms of, sanctions had already happened. Yeah, there's nothing. America has no, because Russia's spent 8 years being under American sanctions. They've already pivoted to having completely different economic relationships anyway.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this is the sanctions can't do anything to Russia. The military aid can't really do very much to Russia actually directly because I mean the military they gave Ukraine over the last eight years had a big impact because they built up the Ukrainian military. They gave them a lot of training, a lot of weapons. The shipments of weapons that have been happening, this $50 billion of weapons or whatever now they've given the Ukrainians is basically just like throwing it into the garbage.
Let me ask another naive question. Why is it? I mean, I think I know the answer, but like, for the sake of the listeners, why is it that
asking for a friend?
Yeah, that's right. Asking for a friend. That isn't me. Why is it that this invasion, in its broadest possible sense, or this conflict, is good for America?
Well, actually, I guess ultimately I'd have to. It's not that great. I mean, it's bad. The only people actually who are really suffering currently are Ukraine, like the Ukrainians. Ukraine is completely fucked.
Yeah.
Economically, as I said, was already fucked before this happened. The level of fuckitude that Ukraine is now in is just astronomical. So it's in a state of, I mean, it just collapsed. And the damage done to Ukraine now is, so, I mean, I could list it. There's a demographic, I don't know, catastrophe because so many young people have fled.
Yeah.
And one has to pursue the way refugee politics in the West works. These people will never come back. They'll now live in the West forever. They'll never come back. So basically every woman under 30 in Ukraine's gone. I mean, that's exaggerating, but it's just a complete.
Yeah.
And incidentally, mostly from Western Ukraine, the area that's not part of the combat operations. So there's that. Of course, Russians have directly destroyed like a lot of Ukrainian infrastructure, degraded it. In the male population, a lot of them have fled as well, even though they're not allowed to. The Ukraine closed the borders for, fighting age men, which they define as any man between 18 and 60, although they've also been recruiting children illegally into there. I've seen evidence to that effect. But yeah, so there's the male population is obviously mauled as it would be now. I mean, they're losing up to 1,000 men a day in dead on the front lines. And then lastly, the most economically viable or, the industry of Ukraine was concentrated in the regions which Russia's captured already or will be captured. The East actually, south and east of the country actually is the economically best. And, obviously against opposite of what we normally can see. But the Western Ukraine actually was the most economically backward part of Ukraine, the part that hasn't been conquered and is likely to remain. So even if Ukraine retains independence at the end of this process, it will be as the poorest, it'll be poorer than Albania. It'll be the poorest country in Europe by an absolute mile and depopulated and God knows what. It's bad for Russia because Russia's losing men, primarily. I don't think the loss of material really matters. I think there was a lot of bullishness about destroying Russian tanks, but Russia deliberately didn't commit a lot of its best technology to the front line. So they're losing old tanks. Russia has incredible stockpiles of tanks and munitions. Yeah, I mean, I think it depends what we ultimately see in terms of numbers. I mean, actually, probably the worst impact on Russia is the economic commitment that they will have to rebuild the parts of Ukraine that they've taken. They already had to do this with Crimea, and they'll have to do this in. They're trying to rebuild these cities, which have been destroyed in the course of the fighting, right? So that's probably the biggest liability. In fact, the smartest thing for America to do would just be to pull let Russia annex the entire of Ukraine, and then they'll have to deal with that.
So you're saying it's good. You're saying it's good for America, sort of indirectly, insofar as it weakens Russia to whatever it does.
Yeah, in the kind of medium term. Yeah, it's kind of a medium term win. Look, I mean, actually, it's not good for America as a holistic entity. But very good for the section of America that recently recaptured political power, in the election in 2020, the incoming administration in 2021, who, look, I'd like to remind the listeners, of all the rhetoric we had 2016 to 2020 about Russia. Like Trump was a Russian plant. Like, this war against Russia was announced like in advance. They were going to do it. I mean, let's not forget, Hunter Biden was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars by the Ukrainians. There's a really direct lash up here between current US administration and what's going on and between the US administration and the security state. So it's really, really important that, Trump, although he had the, rank and file loyalty of a lot of the army, the reality in America is that the Department of Defense, the FBI, the CIA, all these agencies were super, super anti-Trump and have now become really imbricated with the Democratic Party, that they regard all these people as heroes. So, and not to mention the kind of military-industrial complex, where I'm kind of circling around to.
It's getting spicy now.
But the $45 billion, which has just been passed, right? So America is in like a situation of economic freefall, like near collapse. You've got to think at this point. Like the situation is so dire economically, and they've just decided to give $45 million. Well, this is basically just a direct grant to Raytheon. Like this is money for all these people, vested interests, the war industries, and probably most of this money will never get to Ukraine. The length of time it takes to actually, tool and build $45 billion of weapons, it's just a subsidy for their friends. And that's, so it's not even, really I should correct myself. It's not about America winning. It's about America as this very divided society, a particular side of American society making itself very rich.
I think that's a really important point in the sense of I think one of the contexts that will probably clarify with the passage of time, but one of the contexts of the Ukrainian-Russian theater, if you will, theater of war, by the way, not as in, is within the context of the dying American empire. I think in the sense that what we now see is, the Democratic Party has been in power for, over a year now, which is, ostensibly meant to be the party, at least historically, of the last, 50 years odd of unions of the working class, is now just totally in bed with the deep state and the military-industrial complex. And that we now see that as this society is in literal free fall, both economically and I think we could say socioculturally, is that all the money that it's being distributed is not to the people, but it's like, money for the boys, which is namely that which actually supports this deeply sick society, which is just essentially weapons manufacturers, and we could say big pharma, but we won't get into that one. But I think this is really the context in which Ukraine is happening. It's we're watching America die, really. Maybe that's hyperbolic, but I think that's right.
I think that's right. And we're talking. If not America, we're watching the death of American supremacy.
Sure.
The unipolar world. And this is obviously unsustainable. It's been unsustainable for a long time, particularly in the face of the rise of China. But what you've seen now is a strategic alliance. And this is, what I've said, what John Mearsheimer said, incredible hubris of the Americans to basically at the same time they're saber rattling with China, decide to start a war with Russia. This is crazy. You need to pick one of these countries to have a war with, but they can't do that. This is an important part of Putin's narrative as well, which is Putin seriously floated the idea of joining NATO, but he also said Russia can be part of NATO, but you got to accept the fact we're a great power. We have to have some slightly special status. You can't treat us the same way. We're not the same as Slovenia, right? And they said no. You just got to go to the standard channels. But they didn't really. Look, the bottom line is America didn't want Russia in NATO. The entire point of NATO has been since day one to destroy Russia. That's what it was accredited to do. Obviously the Soviet Union, but that's still the case. America views Russia as a threat to its unipolarity because of Russia's sheer size and military strength. Yeah. Which this is still the case. It's I think manifestly the case. Obviously the dominant narrative now is Russia's military is severely weakened and have been shown up to have problems. I think the exact opposite is the case. I think it's now transparently obvious that the only thing stopping the Russian army from marching ultimately to the Atlantic Ocean is nuclear weapons. And that was the case the whole way through the Cold War. It was very, very clear that the Soviets could win any conventional conflict. It was only the threat of nukes that could stop them just taking over Europe.
I think it's also that, clearly, and, people have said this much, years ago, and this is not my idea at all, but certainly many of the roots of this problem, and indeed the kind of broader story of America's imperialism is the refusal to dissolve NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That clearly was setting up a problem for the future. But it's also, I think, there's another story here too of the last sort of 30 odd years since the collapse of the Soviet Union of America's foreign policy and also covert foreign policies becoming more and more unhinged, like becoming more. And I think since we've last done a podcast, actually, I've become much stronger on this because I've read some unhinged books, and now I think I always knew the CIA was cooked, but I didn't think I quite understood the extent to which they are cooked. And even the more recent context here is, we've discovered that in the last week it's been shown that the CIA tried to literally kill Julian Assange in London, in an embassy. I mean, these guys are totally disconnected from reality. And also one thing that you becomes clear when you do a bit of a deep dive into the CIA is that they often act without any kind of oversight from the president or sort of I know this is very obvious to some people, but I think it pays to actually say these things explicitly. Like I remember I used to have this argument with my dad a lot when I'd be talking about quote unquote conspiracy theorists, and he would say things like, how could you possibly have this many people in on a secret without someone leaking it? And of course, what I realized is that a lot of these things like MK Ultra, 3 people at the CIA knew about it, right? Only 3, and no one else. No,
but it's now widely known. I mean,
that's right.
One of the things. I mean, a lot of these things aren't conspiracies.
No, that's right.
Because tons of people know about them.
No,
I mean, it's not a secret that. I mean, there's certain things like, okay, we could talk about the Kennedy assassination, but pardon? Well, but I think you need to. I think you need to talk about. I think actually the Kennedy assassination. I mean, this kind of stuff, like I tend to think, isn't very important, but increasingly, I have to kind of concede that it is important. The Kennedy assassination, it wasn't quite when the CIA took power in the United States, but it's when they showed they had the power.
Yeah.
Regardless of what role they played in that and getting into the ins and outs of that event, by this point in time, it's not the presidency that controls the security state in the US. It's the other way around. The USA has a genuine deep state problem. I mean, a director of the CIA in George Bush Senior literally became president.
Yeah, no, this is
exactly right.
I think this is probably the most. This is the real, for me at least. This was my red pill in the last 2 years. Is realizing that not only is the deep state completely concrete and real, it's completely ascended, increasingly so, and it takes time to explain something that is not actually an unhinged take. It's actually, if you look at it carefully, this is completely correct.
I mean, look at this country with Whitlam, but
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
this isn't even America, but the American security state doesn't just dominate America via NATO and a kind of alliance with junior partners. This is the ruling power in the world, like effectively. And I mean, of course, we have to, you have to say, well, look, they have this very important, it's bourgeoisie, like the capital is also cut in on this, which is why you can have Elon Musk saying we'll coup whoever we want. I mean, it's
that's exactly right. There's now this kind of, and I think you've said this before. There's this alliance between capital, in particular, like modern techno capital, and the security state. Like it's now,
they're so close. I mean, they're so closely. The connections are so close, and I mean, they're not new, but yeah, these people are all, they're all the defense contractors. They're all, and they have to be. You have to be part of that. You have to be doing security state work to become a significant capitalist. I mean, it's
good. I like to end on a downbeaten note.
Well, I'm genuinely concerned whether I should put this out there at this point. It's really something else.
It's really, we're not even pretending anymore.
I mean, look, let's maybe I should be a little bit more even-handed, because what you have in Russia actually is a much more overt security state takeover. I mean,
sure,
Putin was like a KGB captain, and the FSB is probably even more central. The FSB. I mean, it's because they don't have this FBI CIA division in Russia, but the spooks are the ones in charge. Like it's clear. It's not even. They don't. But this is always one of the advantages of Russia authoritarian states. They're clear about what liberal democracies dissimulate about.
That's right.
And so what you get with Russia is what you see is what you get. It's a state that is run by security apparatchiks and is nationalist, and they're concerned about the well-being of their nation. And I mean, but I mean, from that point of view, the United States it's not even that, and hasn't been. Because of their global spanning, and not even ambitions. They're a global empire. The United States, didn't just have ambitions to control the world. It found itself with the demise of the Soviet Union basically in control of most of the world. And they've been trying to retain that control. The US security state is just this absolute octopus, and it doesn't have that alliance. I mean, I guess it's had this, this is the kind of alliance they kind of could have with Trump. Like I've said this in the past in print, like they could kind of cope with Trump because, like Trump wanted to play hardball with China and do an economic war with China, which upset a lot of people in America, like, upset Apple because they bought all their components. But actually, the security state could kind of work with that. Okay, we don't like the Chinese, so we'll get him. But, ultimately, they'd much rather have this. They wanted war. I mean, very, very important. Trump is the most dovish president since Carter, the first president in decades not to start a war.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before, but that is such an important point. Despite all the rhetoric around him, and despite all of his personal flaws, what's interesting about Trump is that he didn't play ball with the US security state. He didn't start a war, despite his bluster about wanting to do it. Right, like that's another matter. And actually, Yeah, but I mean,
he was very clever about it. What he did in Syria, actually, which is like he refused to start a war, but he did some bombing. He did some. Yeah. He understood what the minimum was. He needed to expend some munitions, and U.S. troops are. I mean, did you know, James? Let alone and listeners, the U.S. is still occupying parts of Syria. They have the moral outrage about Russia invading Ukraine. They're still sovereign state. Syrian Arab Republic, they're still there on the ground occupying Western oil-bearing desert regions.
I think it's really worth lingering on that fact. I think it's really worth on a few points. One is because often points like that get attacked as sort of whataboutery, but I think that's nonsense because I actually think that's exactly
it's all an interconnected global issue.
Like this, but that is the crux of the problem, is that what we're really dealing with here is the kind of the fickle and totally narcissistic attention of a Western audience, sort of swinging from event to event, while the reality of the actual concrete situation is that America occupies a huge amount of countries at any given moment, often illegally, and we're being directed in a particular way, in this case to Ukraine. But what we're actually, as I said, what we're dealing with here is the sort of the dying gasps of an empire desperately trying to hold attention, hold power, and we're all just these kind of, while we might we change our profiles to, I use the plural very loosely here, we change our profiles to Ukrainian flags, all these kinds of things. And
it's an unusual use of the word "we" to include a collectivity that doesn't actually include the person speaking.
That's right. That's what I was going for. Yeah. But the machine just grinds on. I know that, again, this is something that we know. But
it doesn't just grind on. I mean, that is you're actually greasing the machine. Like
no, exactly. Like we are oiling the cogs. And I think it's really worth lingering on that point. I mean, I really think it is. It's just.
I actually want to say something really out of sequence here, because I remembered something I was going to say before about the Russian casus belli in Ukraine, which was the Minsk Accords. Another thing that I didn't know about, had to find out researching the thing I've written for Telos about it. But, they over Ukraine, I mean, after Russia annexed Crimea, you had this civil war in Ukraine, which ground to a halt, these relatively small areas of eastern Ukraine controlled by separatists. They had these talks in Minsk in Belarus, which produced two different agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II. These Minsk II was a treaty that the Ukrainians agreed to, the Russians agreed to, sponsored by the Germans and the French as arbiters within the Organization of Economic Cooperation in Europe, whatever it's called. And the Ukrainians were supposed to do all this stuff. They didn't do. I mean, this is another reason the war has happened and became inevitable, because the Ukrainians had from 2015 to 2022 to implement The idea was that the separatists would lay down their arms, they'd peacefully come back inside Ukraine in return for Ukraine granting rather autonomy to its regions and having a federal structure that would allow these regions to determine their own language policy. So in Russian-speaking regions, they would continue to use the Russian language, and Ukraine wouldn't do it. They just didn't move to implement it. In fact, they did the exact opposite. They were tooling up for a war, right? Again, this is a treaty they had with the Russians. They just weren't implementing. And, the reason they didn't do that, incidentally, because, Zelensky, when he was elected, was a peace candidate who was going to implement all this stuff. The reason he didn't do it is because if he did it, he would be shot in the back of the head. And I was about to say this earlier, and I can't remember what distracted me. But they had these peace talks early on where within like 2 weeks of the war starting, one of the negotiators on the Ukrainian side was shot in the back of the head by the Ukrainians, right?
In that meeting, right?
Not in the meeting, but like when he got out of the meeting with the Russians, the guy was literally summarily executed for God knows what. I guess not taking a hard enough line in the negotiations, like giving an inch of ground. Like that's the Ukraine that we're dealing with, right? That's what this country is. It's not. Look, again, no illusions about Russia. I mean, what happens to you immediately in Russia is not quite as bad as that, but there's been a lot of repercussions in Russia within the FSB. So the spy services clearly didn't do a good job with preparing the ground for the Russian invasion. There have been a lot of people who've been reassigned. Maybe there's been some arrests, like some people may be gulagged. I'm not saying Russia is a liberal democracy or something like that. But the point I want to make about that is the extent to which, where's that in the media?
Yeah.
Where is the fact that Zelensky, this guy he's got a gun to his head and coke up his nose. The guy is just a total placeman. He's a Russian speaker from the south of Ukraine, has no investment in this war, and he's like literally a paid television actor who's been put into this position. Sorry. Ranting.
Don't apologize.
You were on a completely different.
No, never apologize. I was just reminded of something when the war first started. I was talking to a friend of mine and a listener of the pod, who was I think I might have been talking about some of your spicy takes. I can't remember, but he said to me, and I was really struck by this. He said to me, sometimes the situation is just good and bad. Sometimes it's clear cut. And I thought about this for a very long time, and I think that is not true. I think that things are never as. I know we argue this a lot. It's that a lot of the time things are more complicated than they appear. But I'm tempted to go further than this and say things are never as simple as good and bad. And I think this is just yet another. The more in which it's depicted as a clear-cut case of, say invasion versus freedom, invasion versus autonomy, whatever, the rights of the nation state to self-actualize, the more I'm convinced that, again, not saying that either side is better than the other, whatever, but again, that there is just so many moving parts, and the broader historical context in which it's all happening just makes it so difficult to get a grasp of, and the more that's the case, the less the media will acknowledge that. So I'm really just echoing.
I dislike the general take you're making, although it seems to me in this conflict, if you were going to have a good and evil narrative, it would be the reverse of what most people have on it.
Well, I thought that you might say. I thought you would say that.
But because both sides do present themselves in a good and evil struggle.
Yeah, no, they do.
And I think there are, but as in general, like with this conflict, I think the Russian narrative is closer to the truth than the Ukrainian narrative. So, sorry.
No, I just, maybe this is just moral cowardice on my behalf, but I just can't say either way. But I think it's also like this is in some ways this is also a reflection of us. And so that you're more of a binary person than me, I think, which has positive
binary confirmed.
But that's also just me, that perhaps I'm just incapable in certain situations of actually having a position. Maybe that's something that's a good thing. I don't know. Maybe it's just bad.
Yeah. No. Look, I think that's probably a fair characterization of our personalities or whatever. And of course, I believe that, the entire I believe fundamentally from a religious point of view that there is a drama of good versus evil that subtends everything, which presumably you don't. But So that's like at a philosophical level, I have a real problem with the idea that there's not genuine good and genuine evil. Now, I mean, this is, these are opinions that I developed latterly that I would have absolutely disagreed with before. I mean, philosophically, what worries me about this kind of idea of once you get into like things are always more complicated. That's true, but it's the Derrida move, and at that point, it just everything kind of dissolves because everything is infinitely different to everything else. You just go, well, okay, this side, there's some bad, people are bad on either side of this conflict, and which is true. Of course, it's true. But that's just banal. I mean, it doesn't. Once you get to that point, you just can't say anything about anything anymore.
No, I think that's exactly right, and I think that's the tension here. Is that when I'm trying to articulate some kind of inability to sort of come to terms with certain historical moments while also avoiding that Derrida move, which is to say, well, you can't say anything about anything, which I want to resist at all costs. So it's hard to know what I'm actually trying to say here. But perhaps it's actually just a simpler point about the media, which is just to say that it's just so striking the level of banality that is what we're presented with by the media. It's what you said. None of this is in the media. None of the complexity of this picture is put in the media, which is just so vital for something like this, where there are so many moving parts, and sort of the ambiguity of the situation is part of it. But it's never presented in the media. And there's obviously reasons for that. But it's just, again, it's worth lingering on.
Yeah. No, that's fair, obviously.
But maybe maybe you're right to say, because on the one hand, on a philosophical level, I do want to insist that there's good and bad, absolutely. So I don't think it's not the Derrida point, which is to say, look, there are, where we end up not being able to pass judgment on any kind of moment in history, because that's clearly really, really dangerous and kind of wishy-washy nonsense.
Well, I think there are factual problems with the Ukrainian case. I think it's false. I mean, I don't know. I guess it's dangerous tying up good and bad to truth and falsehood. But I mean, there's one way in which I want to really agree with what you're saying, and it's going back to this fog of war thing, which is, I have like kind of tentative takes about what's happening on the ground, but getting information about what's happening on the ground is so hard. And basically, you just have the narratives you get from either side are just absolutely mutually exclusive. There's a narrative. There's a narrative that says and it's just the standard one in the media that the Russians are killing lots of Ukrainian civilians and so on. And the Russians just don't say that's true. And of course, I've seen this. You've seen this narrative in wars before. I mean, this is the American narrative in their wars. They say, like in the invasion of Iraq, which you're probably too young to remember, but this 1990, and you had this when we had this war, and it was all on the TV about the smart bombs, and as if there were no civilian casualties, and the Iraqis said, the Americans bombed a bomb shelter and killed thousands of people or whatever it was. And the Americans said, no, we didn't. And we all thought, the stupid lying Iraqis. But of course it was true, and the Americans did do it, and that no bombs are really that smart, and the Americans in fact killed lots of people in Iraq and on many occasions. And so I don't know how to. I mean, basically any of this stuff, I'm in a kind of a superposition, right? Because I don't know, when the truth will out about this, this kind of like what is really happening, who's doing all the war crimes. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the only verified instances of war crimes that aren't contestable at all are the Ukrainians, because they've been filming themselves doing them very proudly, But then again, that's very anecdotal. It's like, okay, here's some instances of war crimes. Does that mean that the overall picture is? But I'm still tempted to say that the entire kind of Ukrainian case is built on, claims that if you actually believe them, bad claims, like it's okay to forcibly, ethnically cleanse and or forcibly change the language use in like half of Ukraine to Ukrainian. Like, is that, because that's what the Ukrainian official government, that's what they in effect are actually doing and want. But I think they've banned every opposition political party. That's bad, right? So. Yeah.
So this comes back to my original point, is that I think a lot of the judgments about the conflict are based on incomplete facts. That is to say, most people who have, I'm trying to avoid using the term normies, but here we are. Most normies who have a position on Ukraine would not know most of the relevant facts about the conflict.
Yeah, I must say,
in order to make a judgment.
I haven't had conversations with Normie. It's about, Ukraine, I guess.
I think
It's
that's an important part of the puzzle. I think because
But yeah, that is my assumption. My assumption is like, the standard, blue and yellow flag account on Facebook is they have just read what they saw in the paper and they believe that to be true, which is quite, in a sense, extraordinary for me in this day and age that anyone does that.
It's a clear cut, but it's a clear cut story of one aggressive neighbor invading another.
Yeah, because they want what's he doing? Why is he doing? I mean, actually, there was quite a prominent narrative in the early parts of the war. Putin was literally insane, and they kind of needed to run that because what he was doing just didn't make any sense. There was no, unless you understood, unless you thought what his reasons. I mean, which also weren't reported. Like there was all this thing about how he gave this rambling speech. They didn't talk about the content because it was really a kind of masterful speech where he kind of summarized the entire history of the conflict. And of course, I take it, I don't know of anyone else who watched the entire thing who isn't like a Russian bot or whatever. But there's no counter narrative given. Putin's done it. Why? Because he's crazy. Or that he's Hitler. Although that's a different thing, because Hitler, I guess, kind of a little bit unhinged, but he had like a pretty clear plan, like maybe a crazy plan.
Can't say he didn't have a plan.
No, but he had everything he did, like, although like there was a certain kind of apocalyptic insanity behind it, like it was all, it was all set out like in advance what he was going to do, why he did it. Like it wasn't. Yeah, Putin. There's a bunch of really simple reasons. It's national security, like geopolitics, like it's even if it's totally, I guess the worst you could say is Putin's just acting in a totally self-interested way as a nationalist to do what's in Russia's interests. That would be like the bad side account. But that's just, that's not accurate. I think in many ways he's really tried to avoid this war happening. Like. I guess he could have. What's the alternative? That Putin doesn't do anything in Ukraine, just lets it happen. I guess he could have done that. But that it strikes me as, is that, I don't know. This when and never mind kind of intervening on behalf of other people, but like these are literally like you're going to just stand by and watch Russians be ethnically cleansed, massacred. That would have been the thing Putin would have done, like by not invading.
Yeah,
he already did do that. Right, because
he did it for a long time.
Yeah, that's right. The level of Russian, obviously, the Russian state agencies are probably, giving some kind of aid to the rebels in Ukraine during the war that started in 2014. But so were the Americans to the other side. It's not. But yeah, I don't. I think the strongest criticism of Putin would be he should have invaded in 2014, and not just about Crimea, but the entire country. And I think the standard narrative about that is that he couldn't do it because of Russia was very vulnerable to sanctions in 2014. It didn't have the agreements with China. It more or less had an explicit agreement with China. In retrospect, you can see this is what it was an explicit agreement was, like Russia's going to invade Ukraine and China's going to back him. But he needed to get that in place to do it. And I guess that's sensible strategically.
I guess don't go swimming on Ukrainian beaches.
That is the lesson. That is the lesson. Yeah. People, it's interesting actually, like, because they say not to do that, but what else has Ukraine been doing?
Oh boy.
If the Ukrainian government cared about people in Ukraine, they would surrender. They have a narrative that the Russians will do we're going to genocide them. This is what's being said. There's a good rule of thumb really that everything the Ukrainians say is just projection. The Russians, it depends what you mean by genocide. If you say it would be the most abstract version of genocide.
Yeah. Certainly continuing to arm the conflict as the West is doing is.
Well, it's, yeah.
It's
designed to prolong it and kill Ukraine.
It's morally indefensible.
But there's definitely, I think the calculus there, maybe this is giving too much credit to the Americans, but I think the calculus there is Russia will win. Russia will incorporate the Ukraine into Russia, and the more Ukrainians that are killed, the better, because ultimately Ukrainians are Russians, and the more of them that are dead, the better. So actually, the losses, as I said before, the losses that are happening to Russia aren't so much being incurred directly on what is now the territory of Russia, but on the future territory of Russia. Yes, Russia may get Ukraine, but it will be scorched earth. The fields will be salted. The people will be dead. The bridges will be destroyed.
That seems like a galaxy brain CIA take, but I like it. It's probably right.
This was like the leitmotif I was constantly arguing about, or at least about war in Biopolitical Imperialism, book I wrote about international relations. But I mean, my argument there is not so much this is like the deliberate strategy of the West, but just they just keep allowing this to happen, right? Because they don't. That's not a bad outcome for them. They have no reason to prevent that happening.
No, it's just
like the destruction of a country like Iraq or Afghanistan is like, that's great. Like, then if they're not going to be on our side, let's just like they can be just.
It's just a logic by which they operate, isn't it? There's
It's
a kind of passivity. A kind of
it's a perfectly sensible military strategic logic, but it now hides behind humanitarianism because historically you would literally salt the fields and leave scorched.
No, that's right.
But now you can't do that on purpose. You just do it anyway and claim it was all accidental. I think maybe we'll stop there. I've said far too much.
Right. We're carrying on with the tradition.
What are we going to put hate forest at the end?
Absolutely.
Try and have both sides of the issue.
Yeah, that's right. We like to offer a balanced account.